Hello and good day. For today, our topic is absorption and variable costing. Without further ado, let's start. Before anything else, let us first review the product cost and the period cost. These costs are very important in our topic for today, absorption and variable costing. Recall that product cost is an inventoriable cost, and this product cost is subject to allocation between the unsold units and sold units. If the units are unsold, hindi pa nabebenta yung units, the cost of unsold units is an asset. Meaning to say, the cost of the unsold units will remain in ending inventory. Pero kapag nabenta na yung units, if the units are already sold, the cost of sold units is an expense. Meaning to say, the cost of sold units will go to the cost of goods sold account. On the other hand, period cost is a cost that is charged as expense against income, regardless of the sales performance. Meaning to say, this period cost is not subject to allocation. No allocation is necessary. Why? Because this period cost is fully expensed in the period incurred regardless of sales. Period cost is a cost that is expensed as incurred. Tinatawag sila na period cost because ine-expense sila in the period kung kailan sila nangyari. Dito sa absorption and variable costing, merong dalawang costing methods. At yung dalawang costing methods ay tinatawag na absorption costing at variable costing. Now, let us study kung ano ba yung product costs at period costs under each costing method. Ang product costs sa absorption costing ay direct materials, direct labor, variable factory overhead, at fixed factory overhead. On the other hand, ang product costs sa variable costing ay direct materials, direct labor, and variable factory overhead. Next, period costs. Ang period costs sa absorption costing ay variable, selling, and administrative expenses. At fixed selling and administrative expenses. On the other hand, ang period costs sa variable costing ay fixed factory overhead, variable selling and administrative expenses, at fixed selling and administrative expenses. Observe na ang difference between variable costing at absorption costing ay yung treatment nila ng fixed factory overhead. Sa absorption costing, ang fixed factory overhead ay product cost. Pero sa variable costing, ang fixed factory overhead ay period cost. At this point, since alam na ninyo yung treatment ng fixed factory overhead under absorption and variable costing, we can now define absorption costing and variable costing. Absorption costing is a costing method that includes all manufacturing costs, direct materials, direct labor, variable and fixed factory overhead in the cost of a unit of a product. It treats fixed factory overhead as a product cost. Again, under the absorption costing, ang fixed factory overhead ay product cost. Under the absorption costing, the fixed factory overhead is a product cost because supporters of absorption costing believe that all manufacturing costs, whether variable or fixed, are necessary for production. That means, ang fixed factory overhead ay kailangan para sa production. Fixed factory overhead is necessary to produce units. And therefore, if it is necessary to produce units, the fixed factory overhead should not be ignored in determining product costs. That's why ang treatment sa fixed factory overhead under absorption costing is a product cost. On the other hand, variable costing is a costing method that includes only manufacturing costs, direct materials, direct labor, and variable manufacturing overhead in the cost of a unit of a product. It treats fixed factory overhead as a period cost. Again, under the variable costing, ang fixed factory overhead ay period cost. Under the variable costing, fixed factory overhead is a period cost because supporters of variable costing argue that fixed factory overhead costs are incurred whether or not production occurs. In other words, mai-incur pa rin yung fixed factory overhead kahit na may production or walang production. And since fixed factory overhead is incurred with or without production, fixed factory overhead costs should be fully expensed in the same period incurred. That's the reason why sa variable costing, ang fixed factory overhead ay period cost. By the way, ang absorption costing, tinatawag din ito as full costing or GAAP costing. GAAP means Generally Accepted Accounting Principle. Ang absorption costing ay tinatawag din na full costing kasi nga all manufacturing costs are considered as product costs. Tinatawag din ang absorption costing as GAAP costing because the absorption costing is the one that is generally accepted. Meaning to say, ito yung ginagamit natin sa financial or external reporting. Ang variable costing naman, tinatawag din ito as direct costing or marginal costing. Take note, ang variable costing is not a generally accepted accounting principle. This is not generally accepted. And since this is not generally accepted, hindi ito pwedeng gamitin sa external reporting. But, although hindi siya pwedeng gamitin sa external reporting, this variable costing is useful for the management. Punta naman tayo sa computation of net income. There's a difference in the computation of net income under the absorption costing and variable costing. Under the absorption costing, since this is the GAAP, this is generally accepted. Of course, ang format para makompute yung net income ay sales minus cost of goods sold. Ang cost of goods sold, tinatawag din yan as cost of sales. Sales minus cost of goods sold, that is equal to gross profit, minus operating expenses or OPEX. Gross profit minus operating expenses, that is equal to net income. As you can see, this format is used in financial and external reporting. Under the variable costing, of course, mag-i-start pa rin sa sales minus variable cost. Sales minus variable cost, that is equal to contribution margin. Take note, sa variable cost, nandito na yung variable cost of goods sold at variable selling and administrative expenses. Next, minus fixed cost. Contribution margin minus fixed cost, that is equal to net income. Take note, dito sa fixed cost, nandito na yung fixed factory overhead at fixed selling and administrative expenses. The question is, magkapareho ba yung net income under absorption costing at net income under variable costing? The answer is, it depends upon the production and sales. It depends kung ilan yung units na na-produced at units na nabenta. In order to know kung ano ang may mas malaking income between absorption costing and variable costing, we need to compare the production and sales. Actually, yung difference ng production and sales, tumutugma din yan dun sa difference ng ending inventory at beginning inventory. Let's say mas mataas yung production kaysa sa sales, mas mataas din yung ending inventory kaysa sa beginning inventory. Kung mas mataas yung sales kaysa sa production, mas mataas din yung beginning inventory kaysa sa ending inventory. So this means that either of these two, pwede nyong gamitin to know kung alin ba sa absorption costing at variable costing ang may mas malaking net income. In order for you to master absorption costing and variable costing, you need to study the following patterns. Kung yung production ay equal sa sales, that means there is no change in inventory. Therefore, ending inventory is also equal to beginning inventory. Dahil equal yung production at sales and at the same time equal yung ending inventory at beginning inventory, ang net income under absorption costing at net income under variable costing ay equal din. Next, when production is greater than sales, that means there is an increase in inventory. Therefore, yung ending inventory ay mas mataas kaysa sa beginning inventory. Kung ang production ay mas mataas sa sales and at the same time, kung ang ending inventory ay mas mataas sa sales, ang net income under absorption costing ay mas mataas kaysa sa net income under variable costing. The net income under absorption costing is greater than the net income under variable costing. When production is less than sales, that means there is a decrease in inventory. Therefore, yung ending inventory ay mas mababa kaysa sa beginning inventory. Kung ang production ay mas mababa kaysa sa sales and at the same time, yung ending inventory ay mas mababa kaysa sa beginning inventory, yung net income under absorption costing ay mas mababa kaysa sa net income under the variable costing. The income or the net income under absorption costing is less than the income or net income under the variable costing. Take note, yung tinutukoy na income dito ay net income or profit. Sir, nangyayari ba na mas mataas ang sales kaysa sa production? Yes, this happens kung merong beginning inventory. Since yung beginning inventory nabebenta din, yan. As you can see, absorption costing follows production, while variable costing follows sales. Aside from that, absorption costing follows ending inventory and variable costing follows beginning inventory. Next, reconciliation of income under absorption costing and variable costing. In order for you to know the difference between the net income under absorption costing and the net income under variable costing, use the following formula. Change in income is equal to change in inventory times unit fixed factory overhead. The reason why kailangang i-multiply yung unit fixed factory overhead is that basically, may difference ang net income under absorption costing at net income under variable costing kasi nga magkaiba sila ng treatment sa fixed factory overhead. The income between variable costing and absorption costing may differ because of the amount of fixed factory overhead recognized as expense during the period, caused by the difference between production and sales. That's why kailangang i-multiply yung unit fixed factory overhead. Take note, yung change in inventory, pwede yung makuha by deducting beginning inventory from ending inventory. Another way to compute the change in inventory is to deduct units sold from units produced. In other words, production minus sales. Let us now apply the concepts by answering problems. Problem number 1. G Company makes state-of-the-art toy car. Each toy car sells for 1,000 pesos each. Data for 2020's operations are as follows. Units, beginning inventory, 5 units. Production, 60 units. Ending inventory, 15 units. Variable costs, direct materials, 18,000 pesos. Direct labor, 12,000 pesos. Factory overhead, 6,000 pesos. Selling and administrative, 2,000 pesos. Fixed costs, factory overhead, 15,000 pesos. Selling and administrative, 1,000 pesos. Requirements. Requirement number 1, determine the inventory cost per unit under absorption costing and variable costing. Requirement number 2, determine the total cost of ending inventory under absorption costing and variable costing. Requirement number 3, prepare income statements under absorption costing and variable costing. Requirement number 4, how much is the difference in income between the two costing methods? And requirement number 5, what causes the difference in income between the two costing methods? Before we answer requirement number 1, i-compute muna natin yung units na nabenta. Here, meron tayong beginning inventory na 5 units. I-add natin yung 60 units na production. That means yung units na na-produce. After that, ima-minus natin yung ending inventory na 15 units. 5 plus 60 minus 15, that is equal to 50 units. That means ang units na nabenta ay 50. Observe that the difference between production and sales matches the difference between the beginning inventory and ending inventory. 60 minus 50, that is equal to 10. 15 minus 5, that is equal to 10. Observe also na mas mataas yung production kaysa sa sales. So it follows na mas mataas yung ending inventory kaysa sa beginning inventory. Dito pa lang, masasabi mo na the net income under absorption costing is greater than the net income under variable costing. Let us now answer requirement number 1. Determine the inventory cost per unit under absorption costing and variable costing. The direct materials in total amount to 18,000 pesos. Ang direct labor, 12,000 pesos. Variable factory overhead, 6,000 pesos. And fixed factory overhead, 15,000 pesos. All in all, that is equal to 51,000 pesos. Para ma-compute yung direct materials per unit, kailangan nating i-divide yung production or units produced na 60 units sa 18,000 pesos. So 18,000 pesos divided by 60 units, that is equal to 300 pesos per unit. Same process for direct labor, 12,000 divided by 60 units. That is equal to 200. Next, variable factory overhead, 6,000 pesos divided by 60 units. That is equal to 100. And fixed factory overhead, 15,000 pesos divided by 60 units. That is equal to 250. 300 plus 200 plus 100 plus 250, that is equal to 850 pesos per unit. That means the inventory cost per unit under the absorption costing is 850 pesos. Take note, under the absorption costing, ang fixed factory overhead ay product costs. Therefore, kasali siya sa computation. Pero sa variable costing, since ang fixed factory overhead ay period costs, hindi siya kasali sa computation ng inventory cost per unit. So that means 300 plus 200 plus 100, that is equal to 600. So ang inventory cost per unit natin under variable costing ay 600 pesos. Para mas madali nyong makompute yung 850, i-divide nyo lang yung 60 units sa 51,000 pesos. 51,000 pesos divided by 60 units, that is equal to 850 pesos. Para mas madali nyong makompute yung 600 pesos, huwag nyong isali yung 15,000 pesos. That means 18,000 pesos plus 12,000 pesos plus 6,000 pesos, that is equal to 36,000 pesos. 36,000 pesos divided by 60 units, that is equal to 600 pesos. Next, requirement number 2, determine the total cost of ending inventory under absorption costing and variable costing. Unahin natin yung total cost of ending inventory under absorption costing. Ilan yung ending inventory? 15 units. Imumultiply natin yung 15 units sa inventory cost per unit under absorption costing na 850 pesos. 15 units times 850 pesos, that is equal to 12,750 pesos. And that is the total cost of ending inventory under absorption costing. Next, total cost of ending inventory under variable costing. Ilan yung ending inventory? 15 units. Imumultiply natin yan sa inventory cost per unit under variable costing na 600 pesos. 15 units times 600 pesos, that is equal to 9,000 pesos. And that is the total cost of ending inventory under the variable costing. Next, requirement number 3, prepare income statements under absorption costing and variable costing. So here, i-compute natin yung net income under each costing method. Unahin natin yung net income under absorption costing. Sales minus cost of goods sold, that is equal to gross profit, minus operating expenses, that is equal to net income. Para makompute yung sales, imumultiply natin yung units na nabenta sa selling price per unit. Ang units na nabenta ay 50 units. Imumultiply natin yan sa selling price per unit na 1,000 pesos. 50 units times 1,000 pesos, that is equal to 50,000 pesos. Sa cost of sales naman or cost of goods sold, Imumultiply natin yung units na nabenta sa inventory cost per unit under absorption costing. So that means 50 units na nabenta times inventory cost per unit under absorption costing na 850 pesos. 50 units times 850 pesos, that is equal to 42,500. Now, pwede na nating makompute yung gross profit. 50,000 pesos minus 42,500, that is equal to 7,500 pesos. Next, operating expenses. Ang variable selling and administrative expenses ay 2,000 pesos. At ang fixed selling and administrative expenses ay 1,000 pesos. 2,000 pesos plus 1,000 pesos, that is equal to 3,000 pesos. So, ang net income under absorption costing ay 4,500 pesos. That is computed by deducting 3,000 pesos from 7,500 pesos. Next, i-compute naman natin yung net income under variable costing. Sales minus variable cost, that is equal to contribution margin. Contribution margin minus fixed cost, that is equal to net income. Yung sales, na-compute na natin yan kanina, 50 units times 1,000 pesos. That is equal to 50,000 pesos. Dito sa variable cost, ang included dito ay variable cost of goods sold at variable selling and administrative expenses. Para ma-compute yung variable cost of goods sold, kailangan nating i-multiply yung 50 units na nabenta sa 600 pesos na inventory cost per unit under the absorption costing. So 50 units times 600 pesos, that is equal to 30,000 pesos. Yung 30,000 pesos, yan yung variable cost of goods sold. The variable selling and admin is 2,000 pesos. That is given in the problem. So, ang total variable cost ay 32,000 pesos. 30,000 pesos plus 2,000 pesos, that is equal to 32,000 pesos. At this point, pwede na nating makompute yung contribution margin. 50,000 pesos minus 32,000 pesos, that is equal to 18,000 pesos. Dito naman sa fixed cost, ang included dito ay fixed factory overhead at fixed selling and administrative expenses. Ang fixed factory overhead ay 15,000 pesos. At ang fixed selling and administrative expenses ay 1,000 pesos. So that is equal to 16,000 pesos. At this point, pwede na nating makompute yung net income. 18,000 pesos minus 16,000 pesos, that is equal to 2,000 pesos. And that 2,000 pesos is the net income under the variable costing. Next, requirement number 4, how much is the difference in income between the two costing methods? Yung net income under absorption costing ay 4,500 pesos. At ang net income under variable costing ay 2,000 pesos. So, ang difference ng income between absorption costing and variable costing ay 2,500 pesos. 4,500 pesos minus 2,000 pesos, that is equal to 2,500 pesos. Pwede rin nating makompute yung 2,500 pesos by using the formula change in income is equal to change in inventory times unit fixed factory overhead. Yung unit fixed factory overhead, pareho lang yan sa fixed factory overhead per unit. Yung change in inventory, pwede natin yan makuha by deducting the beginning inventory from the ending inventory. So 15 minus 5, that is equal to 10. Pwede rin nating makuha yung change in inventory by deducting sales from production or deducting units sold from units produced. So 60 minus 50, that is equal to 10. Pwede na nating makompute yung change in income. Change in income is equal to 10 na change in inventory times yung unit fixed factory overhead na 250 pesos. 10 times 250, that is equal to 2,500 pesos. Last requirement, what causes the difference in income between the two costing methods? Of course, the cause of the difference in income between the absorption costing and variable costing is the fixed factory overhead. Recall na ang treatment sa fixed factory overhead under the absorption costing is product cost. Pero sa variable costing, ang fixed factory overhead ay period cost.